So my first try at gardening was actually on my tiny apartment balcony back when I lived in Minnesota. And I just simply started with a few herbs. Needless to say, the results were pretty sad. However, fast forward to today, where I grow the vast majority of my produce from my backyard suburban garden. However, the journey was definitely a process, and I made a ton of mistakes, and I killed a lot of things. I mean, a lot. So today I'm gonna share with you 10 mistakes I made when I first started off with gardening. And quite frankly, these are mistakes that are pretty common with beginner gardeners even today. And even better, I'm gonna share with you tips on how to avoid them. And to make it even easier for you, I have put together an e-guide that is completely free, and I have linked it below. The first is starting too big too soon. I know it can be tempting to want to grow all the things, especially if you're on YouTube or social media and seeing other people's gardens, mine included. But remember, this was a process that did not happen overnight. And if you are just starting off at something that you have little to no foundational knowledge of, there's going to be a natural learning curve. This also means there's bound to be mishaps along the way. That is just part of the process. We have all been there. And so it's a lot easier to make a few mistakes on a few things as opposed to a lot of mistakes on a lot of things. You're more likely to get overwhelmed, discouraged, and even worse, quit altogether. Instead, identify what your long-term goals are and sit down and be honest with yourself to identify where there are gaps in your skill sets and what things you can do to fill these gaps, as well as the small steps you can take to get you closer to your goal. It could be watching a video like this that gives gardening tips. And if you're a doer like me, it could be simply just going out and buying a single plant and experimenting and learning along the way. Whatever you do, start off with something that's manageable to you. And what's manageable is going to vary from person to person. For some, it could be just starting off with a single plant on your balcony, like I did. For others, it could be starting your very first raised bed garden where you start off with a handful of plants. Whatever your preference, give yourself grace and recognize that killing plants is just part of the process. I mean, I've been doing this for like 7, 8 years now, and I still kill things. Progress over perfection, always. The next mistake, which quite frankly, I still make this sometime because I try to test the limits of time, is planting at the wrong time, whether that's too early or too late. In the simplest terms, the best time to plant is going to be dependent on where you live and what it is you're planting. And this is anchored in two important dates: your average last frost date and your average first frost date. And so the average last frost date marks the official beginning of the growing season, and the average first frost date officially marks the end of the growing season. However, if you live somewhere like me that has mild winters and the ground doesn't freeze, things like kale, carrots, onions will grow well throughout the winter. If you're like, where do I find this information? No worries, I got you covered. I'm gonna leave a link below to a resource where you can find these dates for your zip code. Now that you know your average last frost date and your average first frost date, the amount of time in between these dates are going to give you the length of your growing season. This is important to know and to help guide you to know what plants you can actually plant and when to plant them. You want to get a handle of that plant's days to maturity. And that simply means the amount of time from planting that the plant will be ready to harvest. In order to set your plants up for success and figure out when to plant, you want to make sure you have enough time left in your growing season to support that plant's days to maturity. And a lot of seed packets and like tags on plants will have the dates of maturity on it. However, if they don't, you can simply just put plant varieties and dates to maturity in Google and you'll get it. On top of that, it's also important to keep in mind and have an understanding of whether something's more a cooler weather crop or a warmer weather crop. So for example, things like sweet peas or cabbage are more cooler weather crops. And so even though in my growing season, I might have enough time to support the days to maturity, I know that once it gets hot and it's triple digits, plants like my cabbage and my peas are really going to struggle. So for me, because I have such a long growing season, I will typically plant my cooler weather crops either at the beginning of spring or at the end of summer going into fall where we'll have cooler weather. A bonus tip is also to look up varieties that are known to perform well in your area. And a good way to do that is simply going to a local nursery. They typically sell plants that are going to do well in your area. And on top of that, the staff is usually knowledgeable, as opposed to if you go to like a big box gardening center and there's just some 16-year-old there on a weekend gig to just earn some extra cash. Next is underestimating the vital. Someone wants to say hi. Can I have a kiss? Thank you. This is Ritz. The next mistake is underestimating the vital importance of quality soil. Soil is literally the lifeline for your plants because it is the soil that actually feeds the plants via the plant's root system. So ensuring that you are starting off with a quality soil is going to further help set your plants up for success. Soil is hands down the biggest investment I have made in my garden, and that's because it's an input that has probably the biggest impact. With the proper care and maintenance, your soil will only improve over time. If you're planting in containers, it couldn't be simpler. You're just gonna start off with a quality potting mix, and I always like to amend it with a bit of compost and or organic slow release fertilizer. If you're planting in raised beds, for my raised beds, I actually bought in bulk because I have quite a few from a landscaping company. However, when I am starting, a new raised bed and maybe I don't need a whole truck full, I mix equal parts topsoil, compost, and either coconut coir or peat moss. And if you want to get fancy, I add in about a quarter of a part of vermiculite to just add some more drainage as well as aid in moisture retention. If you're planting in ground, I highly recommend sending off samples of your soil for a soil test. This will give you a clear understanding of things like the structure of your soil, as well as the components and elements and where there's deficiencies. And this will give you a clear and definite understanding of what you need to add and amend your soil to support optimal plant life. This next one we are all guilty of, and that's comparing yourself to others. Now, there is nothing wrong by being inspired by someone and using them as a means of aspiration. However, one of the most toxic things you can do is to get in the habit of comparing yourself to someone else. That is because their journey is their own and your journey is your own. That means that journey is unique to the individual on it. This also means how success is defined is going to vary from person to person. It's unrealistic for someone who maybe is just starting off on a balcony with a few plots of plants to have the same expectations as someone that lives on a 5+ acre farmstead and are feeding a family of 6. It's not fair for you to compare the beginning of your journey to maybe the middle of someone else's journey. Instead of wasting time and energy comparing yourself to someone, focus on just doing better than you did the previous time. And if you do need a little friendly competition, get in the habit of being in competition with yourself. Stay focused on the goals you have set for yourself. Track your progress and continue to seek to learn. And as I mentioned before, don't be afraid of experimenting. The next is either overwatering or underwatering your plants. It's no surprise that plants need water to survive. However, just as underwatering can kill them, so can overwatering. To make matters even more complicated, the visible symptoms of both are pretty similar. For example, yellowing and or droopy leaves can be symptoms of both under and overwatering. To mitigate this, start off by understanding the watering needs of your plants. For example, a succulent is going to have different watering needs than something like tomato plants. Ensure you're starting off with a well-draining planting media that also is able to retain the proper amount of moisture. At each watering, make sure you are watering thoroughly and deeply. You might be wondering, okay, I watered, when do I water again? A simple test is to simply stick your fingers 1 or 2 inches down into the soil, and if it feels moist, hold off watering. If it feels dry, water again. Have you made any of the mistakes I've mentioned so far? If so, which one or which ones? And what have you learned as a result? The next mistake is all about location, location, location. And this stems from planting plants in the wrong spot. Just as plants need water to survive, they also need sunlight. However, certain plants have different sunlight requirements. For example, something like lettuce tends to prefer softer indirect sunlight. They can actually do well with a bit of shade, whereas something like eggplants loves full-on sun. Huge disclaimer, if you live somewhere warmer climate like me, the full sun that they mention on the tag, these are plants that it's like they think they like full sun, but they can't handle Texas full sun. So know that if you live in a warmer climate, most plants will do well with some afternoon shade when the sun is at its harshest. Most fruiting vegetables will do well with about 6 hours of direct sunlight. However, these hours do not need to be consecutive. That means that a plant could get 4 hours of sun in the early morning and 2 hours midday. And if you're growing in containers, the best part is that you can actually move the containers around to experiment with different areas of your balcony or your garden. The next mistake is not understanding your growing zone. And quite frankly, I was a few years into my gardening journey before I actually knew what a growing zone was. Growing zones are set by the USDA here in the United States, and it measures the average minimal winter temperature in a given area. There are 13 total, with 1 being the coolest and 13 being the warmest. Growing zones help gardeners better understand which plants and which varieties of plants are most likely to thrive in their growing area. For example, a plant that's best suited for growing zone 5 and below is likely to struggle in zone 9. Growing zones become even more important when you're growing things that need something called chill hours in order to activate bud break, flowering, and fruiting. Examples of plants like this would be blueberries, apples, peaches, and the list goes on. It's also important to note that growing zones are not indicative of climate. I am here in the Houston metro area on the border of zone 9A and 8B, where I live in a subtropical climate. It's very hot and humid, as opposed to areas in California that maybe are also zone 9 that is more characteristic of a Mediterranean climate and tends to be more dry and arid. Research the growing zone for your area. And of course, I am going to leave a link below for where you can put in your zip code to get an understanding of your growing zone. And as you're choosing plants, choose plants that grow well in your growing zone. Next is not fertilizing. When I first started off, I did not really understand the concept of fertilizing. But as plants grow, the roots draw out nutrients from the soil. And what that means over time, the plants will actually start to deplete the soil of nutrients. That means we need to feed the soil because remember, it is the soil that feeds the plants via their root system. This is a no judgment zone. However, my preference is to use organic fertilizers within my garden. The way this works is that over time, the microbes in the soil will break down the fertilizer, making those nutrients readily available to the plants via their roots. With slow release fertilizers, you are feeding the soil that then feeds the plants. Goes to chemical fertilizers, which aim to feed the plant and tends to shoot the plant up with high dosage of nutrients over a short span of time. Chemical fertilizers also can cause a buildup of salts in your soil if they are used over a prolonged period of time, and this can have a very negative impact in your overall soil and plant health. Regardless of what type of fertilizer you're using, every fertilizer is going to have three values, which is known as the NPK, which stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Nitrogen helps support green growth. It helps aid the plant in photosynthesizing, where it absorbs the sun rays and converts it into energy. Phosphorus supports root development, flowering, and fruiting. Potassium supports overall plant health by helping the plant uptake the optimal amount of nutrients, as well as helping build up its disease resistance. All are important in supporting the overall health of your plants. There are some plants that do require more of one element than another. However, to keep things simple, I find that just using a fairly well-balanced fertilizer where each number of the NPK is represented and they are fairly close to one another works just fine. However, in season, some of my heavy feeders I will find need a little bit of an extra boost, like my tomatoes. So in those instances, in between my 30-day feedings, I will apply something called an organic liquid fertilizer. And the way that works is once you mix it up and apply it to your plants, those nutrients become readily available to the plants instantly. Do a bit of research to understand the nutrient needs of your plants. Once you understand those needs, put them on a fertilization regimen. The next mistake is not mulching. Now, today I love me some mulch, but that wasn't always the case. And it wasn't that I hated mulching or didn't like mulching, I just didn't understand the importance of it. Mulching has several benefits. For one, it helps suppress weeds, which might otherwise rob your plants of vital nutrients. Next, and probably the biggest one for me, is moisture retention. When you water a plant, especially in the heat of summer, throughout the day, that water evaporates. By mulching, you help contain that water and mitigate the rate of evaporation. That means your soil stays moist for longer. This also means that you have to water less frequently compared to if you did not mulch. Remember, we talked about the soil only getting better over time? As mulch breaks down, it actually provides nutrients to your soil. However, a word of caution, if you're planting baby little seedlings or if you just sowed seeds, make sure you're not mulching over the seeds and make sure you're not choking out the baby little seedling with mulch, as this can hinder growth. The next one, which I see time and time again from people just starting off with gardening, is forgetting about the pollinators. This is especially important if you're growing things that fruit and need to be pollinated. And the easiest way to do this is to let the pollinators do it for you. The problem that a lot of beginner gardeners have is that they think that when they plant the thing that needs to be pollinated, the pollinators will just naturally become attracted to that one flower or two flowers and pollinate the plant for them. No. Think about your garden as a buffet. You are more likely to want to eat from a buffet that's full and has a variety of foods that's hot and fresh versus a buffet that maybe has one or two things that's just been sitting there. The same applies to pollinators. And so the whole point of it all is really kind of making your garden as hospitable as possible and to the point where the pollinators just kind of want to create a home away from home and create their own habitat. That way, when you actually need them for something, you don't have to worry about attracting them because they're already there. Experiment with planting a variety of flowers with different bloom times throughout your garden. If you're tight on space, something I do is I plant what's called pollinator islands. And this is essentially containers that I have throughout my garden that are just filled with a bunch of flowers. Another thing I do is simply to plant your plants with flowers at the time of planting. And when choosing flowers, choose flowers that are simple and have open petals that make the pollen and nectar more easily accessible to the pollinators. Y'all, making mistakes is just part of the process. No, you're not a bad gardener. It is not just you. Give yourself grace and learn from your mistakes. I feel like those are also just kind of lessons for life. And as a reminder, I have compiled all the contents of this video in the e-guide below, which is completely free. And remember, progress over perfection. That's right. Thank you. And if you've already made these mistakes, or are making these mistakes, it's okay. And hopefully you just make fewer along the way. So you killed a plant or two or seven, there's always another one to maybe not kill. But y'all already know the deal. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell. And remember, every black thumb ripens to green, and it all just starts with a seed.